awe is an emotion that we feel. So it's a brief state with changes in your body and your mind. When we encounter things that are vast and mysterious, that are beyond our frame of reference and that we can't make sense of with our current knowledge structures. And what's really fascinating, just to round out the definition, is that even though awe is about uncertainty in life and you don't understand things, it also feels positive and empowering, and people want to explore and discover and learn out of experiences of awe. So it's an emotion we feel when we grapple with the vast mysteries of life.
And you've done the research around this. So you're saying that it is coded into
ordinary. There is this sense, intuitively, that awe is beyond the body, that it's transcendent, it's spiritual, if you will. But in point of fact, it has a very clear neurophysiological pattern in your body, which is, when we feel awe out in nature, encountering someone's inspiring behavior or music, parts of your brain, the default mode network, are deactivated, which is interesting. So this kind of self-focused region of your cortex quiets down. Oxytocin can be released during experiences of awe. The vagus nerve is activated, this big bundle of nerves that kind of calms and opens up your mind. You have reduced inflammation in the body, which is remarkable, that the activation of the cytokine system, which heats up the body to kill pathogens and is trouble when it's chronically activated, it cools down during awe. And then, we often overlook this, but we tear up with awe. Mm-hmm. We have facial musculature responses. We vocalize. We're like, whoa. And we get goosebumps. And there's a whole science of goosebumps.
Piloerection.
Where, these little muscles around hair follicles are contracting and you feel the sensations of the chills. And all of those they're almost the antithesis of fear and terror, right? Mm-hmm. Which is cortisol and amygdala and, and elevated blood pressure and deactivated vagal tone. Awe is kind of this more open, connecting, calm, exploration-oriented physiological profile. That tells us something fundamental about this emotion, that it really is an antidote to stress and uncertainty.
Well, it's an antidote that not only calms our own nervous system, and what I was struck, and I love the way that you expressed it in your book, it not only calms our own nervous system, but it connects us. It connects our desire to want to connect to others beyond ourselves.
Yeah, that is, and we didn't really think about that going into this 10 years of research that led to the book. But, Anne, time and time again, when you feel awe in our experiments, you can be outdoors by yourself. You can be listening to an amazing passage of music. You can, think about somebody whose life really inspires you. You have this urge to connect, to be part of community, to be good to other people, to share with other people, to make the world and your community a little bit better. And that tells us something fundamental about the DNA of awe, that it is a communal emotion that we're in short supply of today, that we, Sue, you talked about this fire of awe and cultivating it. But, however we do that, what we know is that it's a counter to the loneliness of our times.
Well, when I think of it as a kind of it's an experience that's not someplace you live, right? It's a surprise.
Yeah.
But I would almost say kind of rare.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the way we think of it. So, what about this cultivation of awe? Because that's really where we want to go, is how do we get more of this? This is, I'm sold. If you were selling something, I'd be like, yes, I'll buy it.
Definitely. Thank you. And it is not for sale. It's free to everybody. So, the first point is that your phrase you used is really accurate, which is, it's somewhere else, it is. And I really think awe is one of these emotions of the imagination, where you get beyond your current understanding of the world and this default ego that defines so much of the voices in your head. And you get outside of it, and you're like, I didn't realize people could do that, or that nature could be like that, or that music could transport me to other realms of consciousness, or spirit medicines or psychedelics make me feel like
I
I'm
was
in touch
definitely
with the world.
thinking. Yeah, I mean that's the mechanism for the psychedelics
Exactly.
working, and
Yeah.
so that's rather magical in and of itself.
It is, and a lot of we've written about that. David Yaden, Peter Hendricks, like, hey, these psychedelics, there's no mystery here. It's these transcendent states. But one of our most striking findings, and I'd call it a discovery, Sue, is I too felt that awe was rare. And I also thought that it took a lot of resources to experience. Like, if you ask people, how would you find a big, intense experience of awe? And they'd say something like, I go to the Arctic and look at the northern lights, and carbon emissions and expense and so forth. But in actuality, our research in different parts of the world finds people feel awe a few times a week, right? So it's around us. And I call that everyday awe. In the book, it's in the just looking at the sunset or night sky, or just marveling at how humans behave in cities, and all that they do brings us awe. And so what that tells us, to your question, is it's something we can lean on and cultivate and find pretty easily, contrary to what we might assume, to better our lives.
Yeah, I think the small ways that you were talking about in your book were so inspirational, and really conceptualizing what awe is. Like, even when we describe it as just being in uncertainty. On our podcast, we talk a lot about that. When we're activated in our threat response, one of the ways we respond is by becoming rigid and certain and absolute, right? Like, you're wrong, I'm right. And so the idea of moving the health benefits of actually leaving this idea of certainty and going into a sense of uncertainty, being part of all, having curiosity really is part of how you define awe. Am I accurate?
Oh, fundamental. There are a few core themes to our experiences of awe. One is, as Sue said, like, wow, I'm part of something. A second is I feel smaller, and I'm not as sort of distracted by my ego, which I think is good news for mental health. As you guys, I see you nodding your head emphatically, So that's definitely part of the story of awe. And a third, and when I was writing this book on awe, and I was trying to capture, Anne, what you're talking about, of like, you're always curious in a state of awe. You realize you don't know things. You're really interested in the unknown. And I kept coming back to the word mystery. And I think our culture, we struggle with mystery. We get immediate answers on Google. Google Maps tells us exactly how to get to someplace. Uncertainty is hard for people, and you guys see this, I'm sure, more deeply than I ever would in your clinical practice. But awe is about mystery. It's this delight we can take in not knowing things and diving into the mysteries. For me, it was so poignant. I wrote this book because I lost my brother, my younger brother, and Rolf, and watching him go, I felt wonder and awe, horror, of course, at colon cancer, but I also felt awe, and that's because it was a mystery for me. Like, what is life? Why do people die? How do I keep him around me? How will he stay around me as I live without him physically? And those are mysteries within the awe of grief that led me to exploration. And so I, especially teaching young people who are so, everything's a checklist, and, they got an answer with an app and so forth. And awe tells us we have to really dive into mystery, as you're suggesting, Anne, which is an important reminder about this emotion.
Yeah, in your book, and The Science of Awe, I was thinking it was, going to be, I would nerd out a little bit and things like that. And I could not put it down. And it certainly delivered plenty of goosebumps.
Thank you.
Particularly around the systems and tying things together.
Thank you.
Yeah. It really did. And so one direction is about systems, but
Yeah.
also there's some terms in there that I want to just highlight that
Yeah.
are just so beautiful. So moral beauty,
Yeah.
collective effervescence.
Yep.
And so I definitely, like, in order to capture this, you went to a lot of literature, to poetry,
Yeah.
to, you needed to pull back into history.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about things like, soul,
Yep.
soulish.
I agree.
And language fails us often.
Yeah.
So one in particular that I was excited about to talk to you about is the music. And
Yeah.
you said that, please, share it. What have you learned in your science about music and awe?
Yeah, and thank you. I'll just put a little asterisk by you're one of the first people to ask me about how awe opens our minds to the systems of life, and I think that is, some people believe that's one of the greatest cognitive achievements of the human mind and our cortex, is to see things in terms of systems and not little objects in the world that we
Right.
have
Well,
to-
that was actually one of my big goosebump moment, right?
Thank you.
Was
Yeah.
it worked. It definitely worked. And
Good.
I'm like learning, and all of a sudden, it's like click.
Yeah,
It's like,
thanks.
oh, holy mackerel. This is in our DNA. This is inbred. I mean, this is evolutionary. This is
Yeah.
part of our DNA.
Yeah, and so that's an important point. But yeah, music. So music was, there are what I call 8 wonders that bring us awe. That we did a lot of work in 26 different countries to validate moral beauty, people's goodness, collective effervescence, moving in unison in dance, sports, etc. Nature, then music, visual design, spirituality, and then the more subtle ones of big ideas or epiphanies, and life and death, which it's important to remember. Music is fascinating and really primordial in how it produces awe. And there's a whole vibrant science now on why are we such a musical species, 80,000 years, 100,000 years. Why do we sing, lullabies that have this universal sound structure to them, recent science? Why, to me, a question that's not yet answered is, but I think awe is part of it, is like, we all define our identities in music. You'll hear patterns of sound waves, and it's, for my mom, it's Bob Dylan, and she's like, that's my identity. And for me, it's Brian Eno or African music. That's a mystery, why music reveals the core of our soul, to use your words, Sue. But what we know, in this preliminary science of music, is that one is music opens your body. It just shifts you physiologically to suddenly like, wow, the vagus nerve is activated. Less cortisol. I'm open to the world. A second is that music, certain kinds of music, will repeat the sounds of awe. Right? They're structured around, and this is a central thesis of music and emotion, is music has acoustic features that resemble how we express emotion. So joyful music sounds like how children laugh with joy, right? The structure of it. And, once you grasp that, you suddenly are like, wow, when I hear choral music, I start crying and I think about the divine. And choral music sounds like, whoa, sounds like awe, right? I just heard, I was lucky enough to be trekking in the Himalayas and heard Buddhist monks chanting, and the chanting,
Wow.
yeah, chanting.
What an
is-
experience.
yeah, and you sit there and you're like, the sounds of the music put you into the mental state of awe, just the very structure of the sounds. And then the other big one that we forget is music just turns us into a collective body. We dance together, we move together, our brains are synchronized. And that's a whole new area of science now on how music turns us into the collective, which is, so it, but there's so many unanswered questions. One that blows my mind is that music transports people. You hear a song and the next thing you know, you're like, whoa, I'm 6 years old, or it transports you into different spaces. So there's a lot to learn about music and all, but it's
There was
fundamental
one
to it.
oh my gosh, yes. And there was just one specific thing, and then Anne, I think that you had something, but I think you said in there that there was patterns within groups that ended up producing similar music.
Yeah. That's to the identity question. And this one, I believe, is one of the big mysteries about music is and I love asking people, and our audience can entertain this question of like, think of a time when you were listening to music and you just teared up and felt like, this is who I am. Mm-hmm. Have you guys had an experience like that?
Oh, completely. And you can't name it.
What's an example?
I'm going to forget his name. Isn't that horrible? Once.
Uh-huh.
What is his name? Do you know who I'm talking about?
The movie Once?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
I forgot his name too.
I can't pair. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true. You can put that on anytime, anywhere. And
I got to see him live, and there was something about I could feel myself like connect to the music and sort of completely transport. It felt like I was in the experience with him. It was not that I was observing him. There was something about the way he was able to stir me to where I could just feel, I felt part of something much bigger. Of course, the audience creates that, but it was the music. It wasn't just being there. There was something about how his music transported me that just makes me feel, and it made me tear up, and I didn't want to leave that moment. How about you, Sue?
Oh, yeah, so many. I was thinking also of how it's bonded us with our children.
Yeah.
That by tuning in to their music and listening to their music is a way into their inner world. But the first thing that had popped up with mine, there's an artist named Shaky Graves here that he has a whole band, like with his foot, he's doing the trampoline,
the drum.
You can tell that I was thinking about the
tambourine
kids. The tambourine. He basically, and then he had the drums on his other foot, and and then his songwriting is just amazing. And then he would another thing you said was it was about change, I think.
Yeah.
And so then you get the rhythm, and all of a sudden it's like it turns unexpectedly, and it's just that's part of the feeling for sure. So
excellent. And I just think that the point of the exercise is these examples come so readily to mind, and they tell us that there's something magical about the sounds and the lyrics and the moment of a piece of music that speaks to us, right? And brings out this sense of our relation to big things in the world, our identity, our meaning that we find. And so, I think the science of awe kind of brings new light on some of these old phenomena, like why music matters so much.
Well, and how the connection, why we want to go to a concert instead of just listening. We can get it on our stereo system even better at times, but when we're in the concert and when we're with everybody who is moving and swaying, and how that captures a sense of being part or greater than ourselves.
Yeah. And one of the sources or 8 wonders of life that I got to write about is collective effervescence, and Sue brought it up earlier of like this bubbling feeling of joy and one mind when we move together.
Right.
And in our solitary Zoom worlds of lockdown, we've lost a lot of that. And, and it's profound and people ask, and I know you're wondering, like, how do we recover this? How do we nurture that fire of awe? And one is move with other people. You might join a choir or find a dance society, or I love to write about sports in the book, because one of the things people are joyful about sports is moving with other people. They cheer together and have this collective moment. So there's a lot that awe reveals about old ways to find new kinds of well-being.
It was one way that I thought about that had never crossed my mind, that I think the therapists out there are likely going to relate to this. And this is when you've been a therapist, there's periods of time when you feel exhausted and disconnected, and you just physiologically feel yourself like a wilted flower. I think everyone I know that has experienced a period of time. And then we go to a training of somebody that inspires us or enlightens us, and we're in there. And I've never, I mean, it was during your book that I was thinking of this as I was reading your book, the physiological transformation that I have in that moment that I physically feel. It's not only being in the room with a bunch of people who are asking questions and excited, but I can feel that it's accessing part of my mind that I didn't know. It was bringing me wonder. It was teaching me, and I was learning, and I could just feel myself just like one of those flowers, and once it gets the daylight and it goes like this. And now I'm inspired. And I had never crossed my mind that that was an experience of awe. It was just, I got to learn something new, but I didn't understand why it was impacting me on such a physiological level.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, in gathering all these data for the book, the physiology just impressed me the most in some fashion, that awe quiets that default mode network, which is such a nagging voice of the self. Awe quiets inflammation, which is the overheating of the body. It activates the vagus nerve. That opening, physically feeling of opening of the chills. And it tells us, it starts to point to pathways by which awe heals or helps with mental health, and physical health. That there are these neurophysiological pathways. They are in many ways, the counterpart to the stress response that you've been teaching. And that's good news for the body, and accounts for, it starts to illuminate this is why a strong relationship to music helps you. This is why Emerson said, there's nothing that nature cannot repair, that we just get out into awe and our bodies feel stronger. And I definitely, when I was in a period of intense grief, losing my brother Rolf, awe saved me. On a daily basis, of course I was going to live, but each day I would find it and just okay, I'm strong enough to get to the end of the day and move forward. So I hope our audience, I'm sure they already feel it, hey, this should be part of therapy, right? This should be part of the clinical practice is getting people to feel awe.
And awe is, again, this is so exciting as far as all the impact that it has. And we talk a lot about secure relating, which what we're aiming for is ventral vagal, social engagement system. Exactly. So are there feelings kind of one, here's awe and here's, what's on the sides of awe? What are the other, what are close by feelings?
Profound question, Sue, and so relevant to therapy. In the book, I write about this really cool work I've done with Alan Cowan, more computational type work where you map where the experiences are. And I would encourage people to look at those maps of alancowan.com of emotional experience and expression and music and visual art, etc. But awe is in the space of positive emotions. It's really close to beauty, as you might imagine, love, admiration, amusement, absorption, interest. So it is fundamentally a positive state, which is good news. But we find about a quarter of experiences of awe are negative, and they do not have the benefits that most awe does. They still have elevated stress, they don't help with your well-being. And it raises this question that we've been touching upon, and the key to that is where you start to feel threatened. Right? And it may be that it's your temperamental makeup where you're like, God, if I hear weird music, I feel uncertain, I get agitated. Or if I get out into the woods and I don't feel safe, which is often justified, it takes away the awe. Or I hear the rhetoric of an inspiring speaker, but I feel threatened by it. So threat is kind of the one that you're pointing to, Sue, of watch out, because if that is blending into awe, you can start to feel terror, right? You can
I was going to say terror or horror.
Horror. That's right. Yeah. Terror being about the ending of your life, horror being about physical destruction, and those are nearby, and we got to watch it.
That is really fascinating. Oh, that's interesting. Now, what about animals?
We are an animal, so. But
you're right. What about other animals?
Yeah, I always love tracing emotions back in our, the mammalian evolutionary history, and a lot of, social mammals like wolves and dogs and rats fluff up their fur. They piloerect, and thank you for using the term. And they do so to join in with others to face peril. And so what that tells us is really social mammals have the beginning physical foundations of awe. Goosebumps, piloerection, leaning in, coordinating with others, which is core to awe. That then is elaborated as we become this symbolic species with the cortex and the like. So that's the core is, whoa, something's uncertain. It's maybe perilous. I'll join with my fellow group members to warm my bodies or face that thing that's perilous. And dogs and wolves and rats do that, and the great apes. And, you know, I love Jane Goodall, who kind of put a dramatic point to this, where she observed piloerection and awe-like behavior in the chimps she observed, and said, you know, that I think this is awe and the beginnings of spirituality when you are amazed at things outside of yourself. And that's what sociality requires. Is it's not just about me, it's about how I relate to others, how I relate to the ecosystem. And awe begins very early with these social mammals.
Yeah, and that would make sense, because if it's a system, then, you know, why would it only be in humans for sure, right?
Yeah.
If it's in,
Yeah.
if it's built in, sort of.
Especially if we think about it from a Darwinian perspective, if it's helping us live and survive, and it's bringing us in a community of a collective experience, it would make sense why all sorts of social animals would have that. It brings some kind of a collective meaning, a collective purpose together.
And, you know, I mean, you stated that so eloquently, and it took evolutionary types, you know, Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, it's all about self-interest. That's 1978. And now, 40 years later, people are like, no, we're super social. It's how we met the challenges to our survival. And that raises this question of like, well, how do I shift out of self-interest and become a good community member? And awe, there's no better way to do it than awe. It just, you know, it makes you humble, cooperative, altruistic. Your identity changes during experiences of awe. You're like, I'm part of this group, you know, and it helps us do exactly what you said, Anne, of like, now I'm a really solid member of this collective, and we'll do better together.
You know, what's interesting about that and challenging, I'm really curious about what you were saying about the negative aspects of awe, because that never crossed my mind. I think of awe as more mystical and inspiring. And then when I think there was a research that you mentioned in Japan where they were showing signs of awe of like mountains, and it was gorgeous, or tornadoes.
Yeah.
And threat inspired awe, and it impact, and both of them, you know, reduced the default mode and made us less self-centered. But one of them was more, the negative was more activating of the amygdala. Did I get that accurate?
You certainly did. That was a spectacular summary, and you saved me the embarrassment of trying to remember it. So thank you. Yeah, you know, it's so interesting. You know, we, in more hierarchical societies, more religiously dogmatic societies, or, you know, China, you know, awe has more threat in it. And so it doesn't have as many of the benefits that we've been talking about. And one of the things I think is important to honor about, you know, kind of the American version of awe, if you will, of Emerson and Margaret Fuller, whom I wrote about, and Rachel Carson and others, is like this kind of expansive freeing up of William James, of the ecstatic type of awe that has a lot of positive stuff to it. So, but awe does have its dark side. You know, one of them that needs more exploration, but there's preliminary evidence, is, you know, I'm glad Sue loved that awe promotes the systems view of the world. I think it's transformative for the most part, but it can lead you astray. And there are studies showing like awe makes you see patterns and systems in random digits, right? Awe is probably part of what's so thrilling about conspiracy theories.
I was like, just going to go there. I was,
you know, like, oh, QAnon's got all the answers, you know, and it's this wild speculative theory. Ooh, you feel awestruck about it.
And part of something bigger.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we don't have those, we don't know scientifically, but I think intuitively that probably is true, that there are people hungering for larger systems of meaning and they can be exploited, So yeah, it's, like all of our human tendencies, they can be put to good uses and sometimes to bad uses. So
we were just right. We just turned in a manuscript, actually, that we've been working on for some time. Thank you. And one of the things we were talking about in it was this kind of groupthink versus collective intelligence.
Yeah.
And exactly tying in that we do need to form groups, and it's a matter of kind of what direction that the group goes into. And that is, and we've been talking about like and once you pick your group and you align behind someone, that also serves to calm down your amygdala, because now you're not having to be in that painful discerning, how do I feel about this? You don't have to worry about that. There's a group. That's the kind of the group think.
No, I know. And it's when I was growing up in the late 60s, parents were worried about their kids being awestruck by Charles Manson, and like next thing you know, they're in a cult or, and I think, I always, I love John Haidt's view of this, which is his, he feels like meaning and morality come out of these emotional intuitions like awe. Mm-hmm. But then how we make use of them as a society requires discourse. It requires podcasts and conversations and debate. And we often forget that, that emotions and their wisdom need sort of this kind of structured discourse to debate. Is QAnon, if you just took the physiology like you're suggesting of, oh, now I'm part of this QAnon society and I feel great and my vagus nerve's firing and, I have low inflammation, that was not enough to really assess its impact in society.
Well, I'm wondering if I'm seeing it, a risk of seeing it too simplistic. So help me in this regard. And so when I think about firing the amygdala up in the fear, so we can have an awe and curious, and then we fire up the amygdala and we're all afraid, right? And then we promote division, right? I need a team that can tell me what to do. That calms me down. But there's something that I feel like in the aspect of the unknown, promoting the unknown, being what continues to make the collective rather than the known. So I feel like the challenge is, like you're talking about the QAnon, part of the satisfaction is they leave the awe and they go into the known, right? So it feels like that transformation from the unknown to I've got the answers, we're right, pulls you, the awe might have inspired you towards the group, but laying in any group in a division that says we're right and you're wrong, that's not living in our awe. That's like satisfying the threat amygdala response. It feels like is the promotion of the unknown, of the discourse, of the curiosity is keeping us in more towards what we call the green zone, the secure zone, more towards the awe. If I can stay in the unknown, then I can ask you and I can have discourse. It's when I move into you're wrong and I'm right that I've left that.
Yeah, I think that's a really spectacular intuition, I've spent a lot of time studying emotions that are right at the heart of ethical traditions. Part of my career was on compassion, which Karen Armstrong feels is the key to spiritual ethical traditions. Part of my work was on gratitude, and then awe, love. And I think that we need criteria as clinicians and as teachers and, political leaders and so forth to say this is and Aristotle wrote about this, like, this is a good use of the emotion and this is problematic. And one, I believe, is does it lead you to be more generous to people who are downtrodden and less fortunate and different than you? That's a good test case, right? And another that I hadn't thought about, but you've articulated, Anne, is does it keep you open in the spirit of democracy? Like, I'm interested in other views, or does it close you down? Those are measurable and really interesting ways to assess the benefits of awe. But I will tell you, it's interesting, in part animated by that question. Daniel Stencato and I did a paper, a really nice paper showing awe leads you to see more humanity in your ideological adversaries and see more common ground, which is factual and true. You know, we all want our kids to be safe, etc. So I think that it's a great part of this discussion is to think about what makes the emotions useful for society.
That's lovely, and it so ties in, doesn't it? And what I was thinking though is that there's not a clear group. You know, if a group is dividing, and there's a fear group and then the awe group,
Yeah.
right? Where is that awe group? Right? It's you know, there's not like a movement specifically or a, you know.
Yeah.
It's harder to grab onto, partly because that it's going to be this flexible, you know, autonomous, you know, flat structure.
That's cool. That's really cool. Yeah, and there's new work in political science on how emotions drive social movements, and I think that and there are fear-based movements. You know, there's research showing conservatives feel more fear, and you might think of it in that simplistic way, but I like your idea, and I think there's a case to be made for like this emergent dynamic quality to awe of like it always drives discovery and mystery and new ideas. And so it may be the engine of new movements rather than set movements from the past. But we don't know. It's a really interesting question.
I'm hoping in my little optimistic ideal world that I try to live in that some of the movement of your book and of the whole experience of just really promoting the sense of being curious, be connected to beauty and how important it is rather than let's get the answers and get on the internet.
Yeah.
It's that the use that our political leaders do of fear to get us to jump on board. Our movement is to promote like a different standard that, you know, when our fear gets activated, it shuts us down to the amygdala. But when awe gets activated, we become more generous, all the things, more generative of other people. Like, and so even if it's somebody's threatening our identity, right? Like, oh, you know, we want to get angry and say, don't you see? But if we could stir curiosity in ourselves and them, they're going to be more motivated to listen to you than if they experience shame and shut down and fear, right? Like, and so to really...
time will tell, you know, but I think, you know, one of the reasons that there's been such a dynamic response to this book, educators and healthcare providers and people in prisons now teaching awe to prisoners is exactly what you're talking about. And I probably would have been a New York Times bestseller had I done this, which is, you know, we are a fear-based culture in a lot of ways, and a lot of it is used to manipulate us, be it Instagram or Donald Trump or whatever, and we need to shift out of it. You know, like, you know, anybody who's parented children in this era is astonished. Like, God, there's so much pressure and stress on young kids. It's unbelievable, and their minds have become so narrow, even though they're brighter than any generation ever. And awe opens them up. It's like, and by the way, it makes you better at science tests as well. So that's good. But we need this shift to get out of threat and embrace mystery. But it's you're the ones who will solve the problem. How do you do that?
Well, that's lovely. I'm super inspired. And what a great time to be a scientist right now.
Yeah.
What a blast to study this kind of stuff, for sure.
I know.
So what's coming? Well, I guess if we can just real quickly, I know we're going to be wrapping here soon. From the science standpoint, I guess I had two things. One was from the science standpoint. Are there kind of some bullet points or highlights that you would want to just hit about what you all have learned that was like the most interesting?
Yeah.
And then I was also curious about kind of what's next.
Yeah.
In your, you know, what we need to do next.
The bullet points are, you know, awe, you know, it makes you more creative, more curious, less lonely, connected to other people, and humble.
And this isn't just your opinion. These
are like replicated studies in different cultures. And then we've talked about the neurophysiology of awe. So to me, and this is why I wrote the book in some sense, in part out of the personal struggles of grief, was like, man, I teach happiness. I get asked all the time, how do I make my teenager happy? And now I'm like, go find some awe, you know, whatever it is, if it's a rave or a metalhead concert or Chopin or backpacking by yourself, go do it. Our culture needs it. And then, I think what's next in the awe world is kids. There's not a lot of work on awe in kids. We just published one paper, and that's astonishing. Like, childhood is awe and wonder.
I was going to say, don't they just live in awe?
Yeah. Parenting children can be so awe-inspiring. So that will be a big one. The neuroscience will get more sophisticated. Yeah, it shuts down the default mode network, but what accounts for oceanic feelings of connectivity, right? We don't know. Right. Maybe it's oxytocin networks or so that's big. And then I think that you started with music, and it is a mystery still how we are so transformed by art and music. Awe is part of the answer, but that still doesn't get us close enough to how. And I think that'll be a big pursuit. And I'm going to be working on moral beauty, which is why are we so inspired by people's sacrifice and courage and the like, and overcoming.
Wow, that is lovely. That is incredible. That is magical. And I love the notion of going back and what you were saying, Anne, earlier about going into the unknown, that as you get your mindset, no matter what group, what political leaning or whatever, it gets very easy to just get set and moving back into wonder. And like, I wonder what I'm getting wrong.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I just want the inspiration of wonder doesn't have to be this major vacation. It could be 15, like you're talking about having awe for 15 minutes a day and how that
second a day even.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, a second, like even a minute, just like
minute.
Little moment in this conversation. I've had a couple experiences of awe, like just to note that and savor it. It's powerful.
Oh, that's great. So if people wanted to hear more, your book, we absolutely, every single person listening, highly recommend. Just go get it. Trust me. Doesn't mean you don't need to be a therapist. You don't, it's for everybody. And if this conversation hasn't convinced you, definitely dig in and read this book. You're going to love it.
Let me remind you of the title. It's The New Science. It's Awe, the New Science of Everyday Wonder and How It Can Transform Your Life. And it will be in the show notes.
Thanks.
Absolutely, of course. And how would people reach you? Well, if people were interested in hearing more or...
Yeah. Well, I would really go to our Science of Happiness podcast. We have a couple 100,000 regular listeners, a lot of therapists and healthcare providers. We did an awe series. We've got practices related to awe, indigenous practices by people like Dr. Yuria Salidwin, who's really remarkable. So I would go there as a next stop in the awe program.
That's beautiful. Okay. And yeah, you can find that on our show notes to therapistsuncensored.com/episodes. And there's a little search button. You can put awe. It's going to be right there. What else? What else do we?
Thank you so much. I had such multiple awes today as well. It was just such a pleasure.
Me too.
We've been excited about interviewing you for a while.
Oh. Yeah, we really appreciate you saying yes. I know that you've got to be really busy or you're doing a lot of stuff out there, and we really appreciate it.
It's an honor to be with you and to reach your community. It means a lot. So thank you.